Soviet Union and China's role in Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam conflict was not simply a war between North and South Vietnam. It was a major Cold War battleground where the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China competed, cooperated, and sometimes quietly undermined each other while supporting North Vietnam. Without Soviet and Chinese assistance, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, would not found would have found it far more difficult to sustain a decades-long struggle against South Vietnam and the United States. China's early support, building the foundation. During the 1950s and early 1960s, People's Republic of China was North Vietnam's most important external supporter. After the victory of the Chinese Communists in 1949, the outbreak of the Korean War, Beijing viewed Vietnam as a critical buffer zone protecting South China. China supplied weapons, ammunition, food, uniforms, trucks, radios, engineering equipment, and military advisors. Thousands of Vietnamese officers received training in China. Chinese instructors helped build North Vietnam's military institutions and logistical systems. Beijing also provided substantial economic aid, helping reconstruct roads, railways, factories, and communication networks damaged during the war against the French. During the conflict against France, Chinese assistance was particularly important in transforming the Viet Minh from a guerrilla force into a more conventional army capable of defeating French forces at the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Soviet entry and technological assistance. The Soviet Union initially played a secondary role compared to China. However, this changed dramatically during the 1960s as American involvement escalated. After the United States launched bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, Moscow began supplying advanced military technology that China could not provide in sufficient quantities. Soviet aid included surface to air missile SAMs, radar networks, anti aircraft artillery, fighter aircraft, tanks and armored vehicles, military communication equipment, petroleum products, industrial machinery. The Soviets supplied SA-2 missile system which became one of the most important weapons used against American air power. Soviet advisors helped train Vietnamese crews to operate these sophisticated systems. American pilots faced one of the world's most heavily defended airspaces. Chinese troops in Vietnam. One of the lesser known aspects of the conflict is that China deployed large number of military personnel inside North Vietnam. At various times, more than 300,000 troops served in North Vietnam. These troops generally didn't participate in direct frontline combat against American ground forces. Instead, they performed crucial support functions. Chinese units built roads, repaired bridges, maintained railways, operated anti-aircraft defenses, and protected infrastructure from American bombing. By taking over these responsibilities, they freed Vietnamese soldiers for combat operations further south. Chinese engineers continuously repaired transportation networks damaged by American airstrikes, ensuring that supply continued moving towards the battlefield. The Ho Chi Minh trial. The famous Ho Chi Minh trial became the lifeline of the war. China provided trucks, engineering equipment, labor support, logistical expertise, and the Soviet Union supplied fuel, vehicle, communications equipment, and other material necessary to keep the system functioning. Together, their assistance enabled North Vietnam to transport troops, weapons, and supplies through Laos and Cambodia despite relentless American bombing campaigns. The logistical achievement was extraordinary. Despite millions of tons of bombs dropped by the United States, the supply network never collapsed. Sino-Soviet rivalry inside the alliance. Although both powers supported North Vietnam, they were increasingly hostile towards each other. The growing Sino-Soviet split created serious tensions. Beijing accused Moscow of being too cautious towards the United States. Moscow viewed Beijing as reckless and ideologically extreme. North Vietnam skillfully exploited this rivalry. Vietnamese leaders accepted aid from both countries while avoiding becoming dependent on either one. However, Chinese assistance declined. Hanoi sought more Soviet support. Whenever Chinese assistance declined, Hanoi sought more support. Whenever Soviet influence appeared excessive, Hanoi emphasized ties with China. This balancing act allowed North Vietnam to maximize aid while preserving its strategic independence. Soviet military aid peaks. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Soviet assistance surpassed Chinese aid in both sophistication and value. Moscow supplied modern fighter aircraft, advanced air defense systems, tanks, artillery, naval equipment, engineering support, massive economic assistance. The Soviet Union effectively became North Vietnam's primary source of advanced military technology. American aircraft losses increased significantly because of Soviet supplied air defenses. Soviet equipment also strengthened North Vietnam's ability to launch conventional offensives later in the war. China's concerns about escalation. China's sup- China supported North Vietnam but remained cautious about provoking a direct war with the United States. The memory of the Korean War remained fresh. Chinese leaders feared another massive confrontation with American forces. As a result, Beijing often encouraged restraint and opposed actions that might trigger a wider conflict involving Chinese territory. This sometimes created friction with Vietnamese leaders who wanted maximum freedom of action. China's support was substantial, but it was always shaped by Chinese national interest rather than unconditional solidarity. The final offensive and victory. The final North Vietnamese offensives culminated in the fall of Saigon in 1975. Relied heavily on years of accumulated Soviet and Chinese assistance. Chinese aid helped create the logistical and organizational foundation of North Vietnam's war efforts. Soviet aid had provided much of the advanced weaponry needed for large-scale conventional operations. When South Vietnam collapsed in 1975, it was a result of Vietnamese planning and determination, but also of 2 decades of extensive support from communist giants. China built the foundation, the Soviet Union supplied the technology. China provided manpower, infrastructure support, and early military assistance. The Soviet Union provided advanced weapons, air defense systems, aircrafts, tanks, and economic aid. North Vietnam leveraged the rivalry between Moscow and Beijing to obtain resources from both while maintaining its independence. The result was one of the most effective wartime support networks of the Cold War, enabling North Vietnam to outlast France, withstand American intervention, and ultimately reunify Vietnam under communist rule in 1975. When people think about the Vietnam War, they usually picture American helicopters over jungles, battles in South Vietnam, dramatic images from Saigon. Yet beneath the conflict stood two powerful communist states whose support would prove decisive, the Soviet Union and China. North Vietnam fought the war, but it didn't fight alone. From rifles and ammunition to fighter aircraft and missile systems, an enormous flow of foreign assistance sustained Hanoi's war effort for more than 2 decades. The origins of this support lay in the early Cold War. After the victory of the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, Beijing suddenly shared a border with territories controlled by the French in Indochina. Chinese leaders feared that a Western aligned Vietnam could become a staging ground for hostile powers. At the same time, the Soviet Union viewed anti colonial movements across Asia as opportunities to expand socialist influence and weaken Western dominance. Vietnam became one of the most important fronts in the global ideological struggle. For Vietnamese revolutionaries led by Ho Chi Minh, foreign support was not merely helpful, it was essential. The Viet Minh faced a French military that possessed superior equipment, artillery, aircraft, and logistics. Without external backing, defeating France would have been vastly more difficult. Both Moscow and Beijing recognized this reality and gradually transformed Vietnam from a local anti colonial conflict into a major Cold War battleground. The assistance that followed would reshape the balance of power in Southeast Asia. China would become North Vietnam's first major patron, providing training, weapons, and strategic guidance. Later, the Soviet Union would enter the picture with advanced technology, industrial support, and together these two communist powers would help create most one of the most resilient war machines of the 20th century, enabling North Vietnam to survive repeated military campaigns and eventually emerge victorious. China's role in Vietnam began long before American troops arrived. The turning point came in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. For the first time, the Vietnamese revolutionaries had a powerful communist ally directly across the northern border. Before 1949, the Viet Minh operated under severe constraints. Weapons were scarce, ammunition were limited, military training was often improvised. French forces possessed tanks, aircrafts, artillery, and access to global supply networks. The Viet Minh could wage guerrilla war, but defeating France outright seemed far beyond their capabilities. The communist victory in China changed everything. Chinese leaders quickly recognized the strategic importance of Vietnam. Beijing feared that if France retained control over Indochina, Western influence would remain entrenched along China's southern frontier. Supporting the Viet Minh therefore served both ideological and national security goals. Chinese assistance began flowing across the border in large quantities. Rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, ammunition, uniforms, medical supplies, communications equipment were delivered to Vietnamese forces. Just as importantly, Chinese military advisors helped train Vietnamese commanders in modern warfare. Thousands of Vietnamese soldiers crossed into China for instructions. They studied logistics, artillery operations, engineering, large-scale battlefield tactics. The lessons learned from the recent Chinese Civil War were passed directly to Vietnamese leadership. What had once been a lightly equipped guerrilla movement even gradually evolved into a capable army of conducting coordinated conventional operations across French strongholds. Chinese support reached its most visible expression during the campaign that culminated the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh surrounded the isolated French fortress using artillery, engineering techniques, and logistical methods heavily influenced by Chinese experience. Thousands of tons of supplies were moved through the difficult terrain, allowing Vietnamese forces to sustain a prolonged siege. When the French garrison finally surrendered in 1954, it marked one of the most significant anti-colonial victories of the 20th century. The defeat shocked governments across the world. French position in Indochina collapsed, leading to Geneva Accords and the temporary division of Vietnam into South and North. For China, the outcome demonstrated that revolutionary movements supported by a determined external patron could defeat a major colonial power. For North Vietnam, it proved that foreign assistance, when combined with local determination and organization, can alter the course of history. Yet victory over France was only the beginning. The division of Vietnam created a new confrontation that would draw an even more powerful adversary, the United States. Following the division of Vietnam in 1954, the communist leadership in Hanoi faced a difficult strategic challenge. The North had survived and secured its independence from France, but the South remained divided. In the South, a separate government emerged with strong backing from the United States. What had begun as an anti-colonial struggle was gradually transforming into one of the central confrontations of the Cold War. During the late 1950s, the Soviet Union involvement remained relatively limited compared with China's. Moscow provided economic aid, diplomatic recognition, and technical assistance, but it was Beijing that remained North Vietnam's primary military sponsor. Soviet leaders like Nikita Khrushchev were often more focused on managing relations with the West and avoiding direct confrontations that could escalate into broader global conflict. However, events on the ground began to change Soviet calculations. The insurgency in South Vietnam intensified. American advisors increased in number. Washington signaled its determination to prevent the communist victory. Hanoi increasingly required not only basic military supplies but also modern technology capable of countering American military power. This was an area where the Soviet Union possessed capabilities that China could not easily match. The situation shifted dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the subsequent expansion of American military operations as US bombing campaigns against North Vietnam intensified. Soviet leaders concluded that allowing Hanoi to collapse would represent a major strategic defeat for the communist bloc. Moscow therefore committed itself to a far larger and more sophisticated support effort. Soviet aid soon expanded beyond rifles and ammunition. Large shipments of radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, communication equipment, engineering machinery, petroleum products, and industrial materials began arriving in North Vietnam. Soviet technicians helped install and operate complex equipment that required specialized training. Entire sectors of North Vietnam's military infrastructure became dependent on Soviet expertise and technology. The transformation marked an important shift in the balance of influence within the communist camp. China remained indispensable, particularly because of its geographic proximity, but the Soviet Union increasingly became the source of advanced military power. Hanoi now found itself receiving support from two communist rivals and giants, each seeking influence while competing with the other for leadership of the socialist world. For Vietnam, this rivalry presented an opportunity. Rather than choosing one partner over the other, Vietnamese leaders carefully balanced these relationships with Moscow and Beijing. By doing so, they secured access to enormous quantities of aids from each side. This strategy would become one of Hanoi's greatest diplomatic successes during the war. When the United States launched sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam in the mid 1960s, American planners believed their overwhelming air superiority would force Hanoi to negotiate and abandon its support for communist forces in the south. The logic appeared straightforward. The United States possessed thousands of modern aircraft, sophisticated weapons, aircraft carriers, and an industrial base unmatched anywhere in the world. Few expected North Vietnam to withstand such pressure for long. Instead, North Vietnam responded by constructing one of the most formidable air defense systems of the Cold War. At the center of this effort stood the Soviet Union. Moscow recognized that the struggle in Vietnam offered an opportunity to challenge American military power without engaging in direct combat. Every American aircraft shot down would demonstrate the effectiveness of Soviet technology and strengthen the prestige of the Communist bloc. Beginning in the 1965, large shipments of Soviet military equipment flowed into North Vietnam. Among the most important were the SA-2 surface-to-air missile systems, originally designed to defend Soviet airspace. These missiles were capable of striking aircraft flying at high altitudes and long ranges. Their arrival fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. Soviet specialists assisted in assembling radar networks, command centers, and missile batteries across North Vietnam. Vietnamese crews underwent extensive training to learn how to operate increasingly sophisticated equipment. In the early stages, Soviet advisors played an active role in helping establish operational procedures and maintenance systems. Over time, Vietnamese personnel mastered the technology and assumed greater responsibility for combat operations. The impact on American air operation was immediate. US pilots who had previously faced relatively limited threats suddenly found themselves navigating a dense network of radar-guided missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and interceptor aircraft. Warning alarms became a constant fear of missions over North Vietnam. Pilots often described seeing missile trails climbing rapidly towards their aircraft, forcing evasive maneuvers that disrupted bombing routes and increased operational risks. The Soviet contribution extended beyond missiles. Moscow supplied modern fighter aircraft such as the MiG-21 and MiG-17s. These fighters, flown by Vietnamese pilots, engaged American aircraft in aerial combat and added another layer to North Vietnam's defenses. Combined with ground-based missile systems and anti-aircraft guns, they created a multi-layered defense network that became increasingly difficult for the United States to suppress. American forces adopted with new tactics, electronic warfare systems, and specialized suppression missions. Yet, every adaptation required additional resources and effort. The objective of North Vietnam's air defense strategy was not necessarily to defeat American air power outright, but to raise its costs, reduce its effectiveness, and demonstrate that bombing alone could not break Hanoi's will. By the late 1960s, North Vietnam had become one of the most heavily defended regions in the world. Soviet technology had transformed the battlefield, forcing the United States into a prolonged contest of adaptation and attrition. While Soviet missile guarded the skies, however, another crucial element of the war effort was being sustained on the ground by China. Behind the front lines, hundreds of thousands of Chinese personnel were helping keep North Korea functioning despite its relentless bombardment. While Soviet missiles and fighter aircraft attracted international attention, China's contribution to the war often unfolded away from the cameras and headlines. Yet, in terms of manpower, Beijing's commitment was enormous. At the height of its involvement, China deployed hundreds of thousands of military personnel inside North Vietnam, making it one of the largest foreign military presence of the entire conflict. Chinese leaders faced a strategic dilemma. They wanted to support Hanoi and prevent American victory, but they also wished to avoid direct war with the United States. The memory of the Korean War remained fresh. China had suffered massive casualties during that conflict and had no desire to repeat the same experience. As a result, Beijing adopted a policy that maximized support while minimizing the risk of direct confrontation. Beginning in the mid-1960s, a large number of Chinese engineering, construction, logistics, and air defense units entered Vietnam. These troops generally remained behind the front lines. Their mission was not to invade South Vietnam or to engage American ground forces directly. Instead, they performed the essential tasks that allowed North Vietnam to continue functioning under constant bombardment. American aircraft repeatedly targeted bridges, railways, roads, power facilities, and transportation hubs. Every successful strike threatened to disrupt the Chinese movement of troops and supplies. Chinese engineering units responded by repairing damaged infrastructure at remarkable speed. Bridges destroyed during the day were often restored by or bypassed within hours. Railway lines damaged by bombs were rebuilt, allowing trains carrying military equipment and economic supplies to continue operating. Chinese soldiers also helped reconstruct entirely new transportation routes designed to reduce vulnerability to American attacks. Roads were camouflaged, tunnels were excavated, and alternate supply routes were developed. These efforts complicated American attempts to isolate North Vietnam from its external source of support. In addition to engineering work, Chinese anti-aircraft units defended key facilities throughout northern regions of the country. Their presence freed Vietnamese troops for service elsewhere, allowing Hanoi to concentrate more of its own manpower on combat operations and logistical activities related to the war in the south. The scale of the commitment was extraordinary. Over the course of the conflict, more than 300,000 Chinese personnel served in North Vietnam, although they rarely engaged in direct combat against American ground troops. They contributed at their contribution became an indispensable component of Hanoi's ability to withstand years of bombing. For American planners, this created a difficult problem. Attacking Chinese forces directly risked provoking a wider regional war, potentially drawing China into the conflict on a much larger scale. Washington therefore had to balance military objectives against the danger of escalation, a constraint that indirectly benefited Hanoi.